On the morning of March 3, 2026, the captain of a commercial oil tanker in the Persian Gulf received a message over VHF radio. It was short. It was official. It came from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. It said, "No ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz." He looked at his cargo, 2 million barrels of crude oil. He looked at the narrow water ahead of him, and he turned his ship around. By that evening, 15 million barrels of oil per day had stopped moving. The world didn't feel it immediately, but it would. March 2, 2026. The Persian Gulf. A Thai-flagged bulk carrier moves through the narrowing water. The crew has sailed this route dozens of times. The transit is routine. It is supposed to be routine. Then the radio crackles. A voice in accented English, calm and precise, transmits on VHF channel 16, the international distress and calling frequency, the one every vessel in the world monitors. The message is not a warning. It is not a negotiation. It is a declaration. No ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz. The crew doesn't move. The captain stares at the channel ahead, 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. Behind him, 2 million barrels of crude oil. Ahead of him, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, with fast attack craft, anti-ship missiles, sea mines, and a direct order from Tehran's new supreme leader to close this waterway to the world. He turns the ship around, and in doing so, he becomes one of the first captains of what will become the most severe disruption to global energy supply in 50 years. This is the Strait of Hormuz crisis. And it is not over. To understand what is happening right now, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. Not geographically, but economically. It is a 21-mile pinch point between the Iranian coast and the Omani coast. On a map, it looks almost absurdly small, a narrow sliver connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the Arabian Sea and the world's oceans. But through that sliver flows approximately 20% of all oil traded globally. Every single day, roughly 15 million barrels of crude oil, plus 5 million barrels of refined petroleum products, pass through that waterway. Qatar, the world's top exporter of liquefied natural gas, sends nearly every cubic meter of its length through that passage. Saudi Arabia's eastern oil fields are linked to global markets through this strait. Kuwait, Iraq, Bahrain, the UAE, every one of their energy exports passes through Hormuz. There is no pipeline alternative large enough to replace it. There is no viable bypass that can move that volume. The Saudi PDVSA pipeline, the one sometimes cited as an alternative, moves perhaps 2.5 million barrels per day at full capacity. The gap is not bridgeable. When the International Energy Agency's director said that 15 million barrels per day were stranded, that was not a metaphor. That was fuel that wasn't reaching power plants, wasn't reaching refineries, wasn't reaching the ships and trucks and factories that global logistics runs on. Iran understood this precisely, and they planned for it. Iran's strategy in the Strait of Hormuz is not new. It has been rehearsed, refined, and war-gamed for decades. Iranian military planners call it asymmetric naval warfare. Western analysts have a blunter name for it: the swarm. The IRG Navy is built around a specific doctrine: you don't defeat the United States Navy in open battle. You make the cost of every single transit unacceptably high. The tools of that strategy are cheap, numerous, and lethal. Fast attack craft, small, fiberglass-hulled speedboats capable of 60 knots, carrying rocket-propelled grenades, recoilless rifles, and limpet mines. Anti-ship cruise missiles mounted on mobile launchers along the Iranian coastline. Concealed, repositioned constantly, difficult to pre-target. Sea mines, Iran's most underreported weapon, hundreds of them, capable of being laid by small vessels at night, invisible to most commercial ship sensors, and survivable for months once placed in shallow water. Iran deployed all three. By March 6, 2026, US Central Command confirmed it had destroyed 44 Iranian mine layers. But CENTCOM did not confirm it had destroyed the mines those vessels had already deployed. That distinction matters enormously. A mine in the water doesn't need a crew. It doesn't need orders. It doesn't run out of patience. It just waits. And that is the genius of Iran's strategy. Even if every Iranian fast attack craft is sunk, even if every coastal missile battery is destroyed, the mines already laid turn the strait into a kill zone until every single one is found and neutralized. A process that takes weeks, requires specialized vessels, and forces any escorted convoy to move at a crawl through a narrow channel while Iranian shore-based systems continue to operate. Iran built a trap. And then they waited for the world to walk into it. By the second week of March, the United States had moved with extraordinary speed and scale. The US Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was already in the Arabian Sea. The US Gerald R. Ford, the largest, most expensive warship ever built, was operating in the eastern Mediterranean and was redirected south. A third carrier, the US George H.W. Bush, was ordered out of Norfolk, Virginia, and began the transatlantic transit. 3 carrier strike groups. More than 200 aircraft. Over 800 individual missile launch cells across the escorts. It was the most concentrated naval power deployed to a single theater in decades. And it still wasn't enough to simply reopen a 21-mile strait. Because the problem wasn't a fleet. The problem wasn't even a military at all, in the traditional sense. The problem was a coastline, 1,500 miles of Iranian shoreline, riddled with mobile launch systems, hardened underground facilities, and a naval force that had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this confrontation. Every time U.S. aircraft struck an Iranian coastal battery, a replacement launcher appeared somewhere else on the coast. Every time CENTCOM announced the destruction of Iranian minilayers, Iran announced new restrictions on the shipping lanes. It was a tactical game of erasure that Iran had designed specifically to frustrate the kind of overwhelming conventional force the United States brings to every fight. By March 11th, a Thai bulk carrier, the Mayari Nari, was on fire in the strait. It was the visual image the world had been waiting for, and it confirmed what the insurance markets already knew. The strait was not passable at acceptable risk. War risk insurance premiums for a single Hormuz transit, which had been 0.125% of vessel value before the war began, had climbed to 0.4%, representing tens of millions of dollars per voyage for large tankers. Most commercial operators simply stopped. The American military response was sustained and significant. Over 130 Iranian naval vessels were destroyed by early April. 44 mine layers, gone. Coastal missile systems struck repeatedly. The Urgi-Sea's Hengam Island position, a strategic staging point in the strait itself, was hit in airstrikes on April 1st. Iran's top naval commander, Admiral Alireza Tangsiri, the man personally overseeing the blockade operation, was killed by an Israeli strike on March 26th. And yet the strait remained closed. What the military could destroy, it destroyed. What it could not destroy were the dynamics that made Iran willing to absorb those losses. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, elevated to power after his father's assassination in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury, issued his first statement with clarity. The strait would remain a tool of pressure. The blockade was not a tactical decision. It was a strategic posture. Iran was not going to blink under firepower alone. Simultaneously, the United States found itself diplomatically isolated in a way that complicated its military options. Trump publicly called on 22 nations to contribute warships to a coalition to reopen the strait. Germany said no. Spain said no. Japan said the threshold for deployment was extremely high. France denied it was sending vessels. The European Union failed to agree on expanding its naval mandate. Even Australia declined. Multiple U.S. allies declined to join the one operation that might have made a difference, not because they doubted American military power, but because they did not want to assume co-ownership of a war that began with strikes they had not sanctioned. This was the second dimension of Iran's strategy. Not just to make the military cost of reopening the strait high, but to make the diplomatic cost of assembling a coalition equally high. Here is where it gets dangerous. On April 5, 2026, Easter Sunday, President Trump posted a message on Truth Social. The language was direct. If Iran did not reopen the Strait of Hormuz completely without threat, within 48 hours, the United States would strike and destroy Iranian power plants and bridges, starting with the largest. He called it Power Plant Day. He called it Bridge Day. He set a deadline, April 6th. The strait was still closed. This is the narrow margin at the center of this crisis. Not a missile trajectory, not a torpedo run. A political deadline, publicly stated, attached to an escalatory threat, against a country that has already absorbed thousands of airstrikes and is still holding the world's most critical waterway shut. If Trump executes the threat, Iran escalates further. If he does not, the deterrent credibility of every future deadline is damaged. Iran knows both of those facts. They have always known them. The trap wasn't the mines in the water. The trap was this moment, where American power and American credibility are in direct tension, and the only path forward forces a choice between military escalation and political retreat. That is the asymmetric victory Iran designed, not to defeat the US Navy, to put American decision-makers in a position where winning looks like losing. As of today, the strait is effectively still closed. A selective transit regime exists. Iran has allowed certain Indian vessels through, negotiated passage for Turkish tankers, and continued to allow Chinese-linked tankers to move. Iranian oil continues to flow to China through what analysts call the shadow fleet. The rest of the world waits. Oil has crossed $100 per barrel. Gasoline prices in the United States are at their highest level in nearly 2 years, up 65 cents per gallon since the war began. The IA has warned of cascading supply disruptions. Farmers in Australia are reporting difficulties sourcing diesel for planting season. The global economy is not in a managed crisis. It is in a real one, unfolding in slow motion. Meanwhile, the United States is burning through precision munitions at a rate that is drawing serious concern. JASSM-ER stockpiles, the long-range missile most used in the campaign, have dropped to approximately 425 globally. B-2 bombers, each requiring 119 maintenance hours per flight hour after a bombing mission, are cycling through depot maintenance windows that reduce available strike capacity. The E-3 AWACS battle management aircraft that was destroyed on the ground at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia has no ready replacement. The math is changing. Not dramatically. But it is changing. What this crisis reveals is something that military historians will study for decades. The Strait of Hormuz is proof that geography is still the dominant variable in naval warfare, despite all advances in technology, sensors, and force projection. A nation with a fraction of America's defense budget, a nation that has absorbed thousands of airstrikes, continues to hold a choke point that the entire weight of US naval power cannot simply force open without accepting costs that no administration wants to publicly justify. Iran did not beat the US Navy. No one is suggesting that. But Iran did not need to beat the US Navy. It only needed to make the cost of reopening the strait higher than the cost of waiting. And it succeeded. This is the doctrine of asymmetric geographic control. Small nations with coastlines and patience can impose costs on far larger powers by exploiting a simple fact. Defending a port is easier than assaulting one. Mining a narrow channel costs tens of thousands of dollars. Sweeping that channel costs hundreds of millions, requires specialized vessels, and exposes those vessels to continued threat throughout the operation. Iran spent years building this capability precisely because it could not compete conventionally. The fast attack craft, the mobile missile launchers, the mine stockpiles, the redundant command structure, all of it was optimized for this scenario. Not a sea battle. A siege. The larger lesson, for planners watching in Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow, is this. The United States can destroy almost anything it can target. What it struggles with is sustained, dispersed, low-cost resistance designed to impose costs without presenting targetable concentrations of force. Iran has written the playbook. Others are reading it carefully. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 nautical miles wide. 2 miles wider than that is the English Channel at its narrowest point. It is a distance a commercial aircraft crosses in under 3 minutes. It is a gap that, on a map of the world, appears almost too small to find without a magnifying glass. And yet that gap, that 21-mile channel between a mountainous Iranian coastline and the Omani desert, is the single most strategically important piece of water on the planet, more than any naval base, more than any carrier strike group, more than any missile battery. The strait itself is the weapon Iran has wielded with devastating precision. 3 aircraft carriers, 12,000 combat sorties, and the threat of destroying power plants have not moved it. Because geography doesn't respond to ultimatums. The world's oil is still waiting. The tankers are still anchored, the pumps are still climbing, and somewhere in the northern Arabian Sea, beneath 200 feet of dark water, a British nuclear submarine is sitting very still, waiting for orders that no one has yet been willing to give. The strait is closed. For now.